I want to welcome you to U.S. History 1, which will cover a period beginning with early American encounters with Europeans until the Reconstruction period following the American Civil War. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Randy Wells. I've been an instructor at West Coast Baptist College since 2014. My family and I have been members of Lancaster Baptist Church for about 28 years now. I have a bachelor's degree in military history from American Military University, and I then earned my master's degree in history from Liberty University. And currently, I am a dissertation away from my PhD in history from Liberty University. Also, I served 25 years in the U.S. military, retiring as a master sergeant back in 2007. For this particular course, there are some suggestions that I want to give you, which will hopefully enable you to do quite well in this course. First of all, I'd like you to take a look at your syllabus. So if you want to access that right now, that would be great. And we'll cover a few basics. First of all, in section 3, the course requirements are listed for you there. And these are the tasks that you're going to need to accomplish in order to successfully navigate and complete this course. Now, since this is a 7-week course, there's going to be a lot packed into those 7 weeks. There's only one textbook, which I'm requiring you to read, 2 chapters from the book each week, pretty much, and during the final week, 3 chapters. Any handouts or materials required will be added to that week's module. And incidentally, about the textbook that you're going to need is entitled American History Volume 1, 1492 to 1877 by Thomas S. Kidd. I've personally read this textbook. It's a great work. Thomas Kidd is a Christian man, and he's written this textbook from a Christian worldview. I'm going to state at the outset that if you don't read the assigned readings, there's really no way that you're going to be able to successfully pass this course, especially when it comes to the 7 quizzes that you'll have to take, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Videos. This course is video dependent. Every lecture is going to be via a video. These videos that I will record for you will be anywhere from 25 to 30, maybe 40 minutes at the most long. And if the video is going to go over 30 minutes, I'll probably break it into 2 videos. For each module, there'll be a test or quiz. These tests or quizzes are open book, but they are timed, so I want you to be aware of that. There's a weekly discussion board that you'll be required to complete as well, or a DB for short. And studies have shown that students who participate in discussion boards significantly increase their retention of the material by about 40% as compared to just reading the text. The requirements for your discussion boards revolve around you answering questions that I've posted in the discussion board with a substantial posting of 250 to 300 words minimum. And when composing your discussion board posts, please make sure that you use proper grammar and that you cite your work using the proper citation mechanics. And for history courses, that would be the Chicago Manual of Style or the Turabian method. Don't use abbreviations or contractions. And before you post your discussion board, check your grammar. Make sure that you don't write the way you talk. Also, when composing your response, please consider outside sources, the library, online databases like JSTOR or EBSCO. Please only use academic scholarly sources and avoid online encyclopedias, Wikipedia, dictionaries, etc. Those are not scholarly sources. And then finally, ensure that you don't have any spelling errors. There's really no way in 2023 that anybody with a laptop or some sort of word processing software should have spelling errors, because you can spell check everything. Another written assignment that you're going to be required during this course to write is an annotated bibliography. And the instructions for this are in Canvas, so I'm not going to go over that right now. You're also going to need to write a 10 to 15 page, not including the cover page or the bibliography, a biographical research paper on a person listed in the approved character list that's already in Canvas for this course. Another assignment will be for you to create a PowerPoint presentation on a significant event that occurred in early American history. And I've given some topics in Canvas that you can select. And if you want to go outside those topics, just ask me, and I'm sure it'll be fine. The presentation, the PowerPoint, and it can also be in Keynote if you don't have PowerPoint, must be between 5 to 9 slides. It needs to include presentation notes, visuals, and it needs to be of such an academic caliber that you could use it for secondary education. Now, sources for your presentation should be cited in a final bibliography slide, and you must use at least 5 scholarly sources. Your work needs to be original, not a copy of another PowerPoint presentation, and then you'll need to submit that PowerPoint via online, or you can just simply email it to me. So, to sum it all up, you're going to be required for this course to write 7 discussion boards, 1 research paper, 1 annotated bibliography. You're going to need to create 1 PowerPoint presentation and take 7 quizzes. And you need to read the entire textbook. The textbook's about 320 pages, so that's not overly terrible. Now, while I know that this sounds like a lot, effective time management is going to be a critical factor for you during this course. If at any time you begin to struggle or you have questions that you want clarification, please reach out to me. You'll find that I'm very responsive to text messages or emails via the Canvas system. And those of you that have taken courses with me previously know that I'll usually reply to you either immediately or within a couple hours. And my contact information is listed on the bottom of the syllabus. So, with all that out of the way, let's speak a little bit about the first couple chapters that you're going to need to familiarize yourself with for this week. To begin, the first human beings to wind up in what we now call America were likely from Northeast Asia and may have crossed over a land bridge that is now known as the Bering Strait, connecting Alaska with the Soviet Union, Russia. As early Native Americans began settling the land, corn, squash, and beans, known as the Three Sisters, became the staple of Native American agriculture. The first encounters between Native Americans and Europeans happened in what we now call Cuba, when Christopher Columbus landed in 1492 in what he believed was the country of India, which is why he called the Taino natives that lived there Indians, and that name kind of stuck. Just to be clear, an Italian explorer named John Cabot was actually the first European to land on the North American mainland when he landed in Canada in 1497. The driving factor for transatlantic exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries was improvements in sailing technologies, as well as the quest for better land and wealth. Once more and more explorers began interacting with the indigenous peoples of North America, a phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange began. The phrase the Columbian Exchange is taken from the title of Alfred W. Crosby's 1972 book, which divided the exchange into 3 categories: diseases, animals, and plants. As an example of this, when Hernando Cortez landed in Mexico in 1519, his interaction with the Aztecs resulted in a majority of those natives contracting and dying from smallpox. In fact, about 8 million Indians died of smallpox within 10 years of Cortez's invasion of Mexico. Many explorers had built up an immunity to the disease and unknowingly spread it throughout the Americas. The Aztecs introduced Cortez and his men to chocolate, and aren't you glad that they did? And those explorers, of course, carried that back to the Old World Europe. Horses were another aspect of the Columbian Exchange, in that Cortez brought horses with him aboard his ships when he landed in Mexico. Prior to that time, there were no horses in the Americas. Many other things were exchanged during this period of exploration, some knowingly, like crops and animals, and some unknowingly, like disease pathogens. Another commodity exchange that surfaced between the 15th through the 18th centuries, were slaves. It was the Portuguese explorers who first began exposing or exporting slaves from the Gold Coast of Africa to work the sugar plantations in islands off the coast of Africa, and the development of these sugar colonies is what sparked the European concept of chattel slavery and the plantation system that we know developed in mainland America and the Caribbean islands. In fact, the Portuguese founded the port of Elmina along the Gold Coast of Africa, which ended up being the largest colonial town in West Africa and one of the largest exporters of African slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. By the 1820s, forced immigration of slaves across the Atlantic from Africa outpaced the number of explorers heading to the Americas. Another aspect of the interaction that resulted between European and Native Americans was the introduction of Christianity and other belief systems that the Europeans brought with them. The Catholic Church saw it as their primary mission to Christianize, if you will, the native heathen, and so a group called Franciscan priests began to convert various tribes to Catholicism. Protestant missionaries also sought to bring the true gospel to the Indians. When it came to European exploration, the French and English were a little behind the Spanish and Portuguese. This is likely because the Portuguese and Spanish had developed better ships called caravels that allowed them to travel the Atlantic Ocean faster. Shortly after Cortez landed in Mexico, the French sent Jacques Cartier to Canada, and when Cartier arrived in northeastern Canada, he thought it might be the land God had banished Cain to after he killed his brother Abel. More French immigrated to Canada and introduced the fur trade to Native Americans there, and it was that fur trade that exacerbated the eventual conflict between Europeans and Native Americans from the Iroquois tribe. In 1585, Queen Elizabeth of England commissioned Walter Raleigh to find a suitable colony for settling in the Americas. Raleigh reached the outer banks of North Carolina, but the group of 100 people that he brought with him died out. So in 1607, a second group of English colonizers landed in Jamestown, Virginia. They called it Jamestown because of the new English monarch, King James VI of Scotland, also known as King James I. In 1606, King James authorized the Virginia Company of London, which allowed financial investors to take a chance on establishing a new colony in the Americas. When those settlers arrived in Jamestown, there were already about 20,000 Native Americans living there. The Powhatan, Powhaten, Powhatan Indians being the most numerous. But the harsh living conditions of Virginia, coupled with the interactions with hostile Native Americans, resulted in most of the colony dying out within the first few years of arrival. And by the mid 1610s, the colonists were introduced to what would become a highly lucrative cash crop called tobacco. The humid climate of Virginia proved to be ideal for harvesting tobacco. Growing prosperity meant that the colony was going to need more laborers. And at first, these laborers came primarily from England, and they were known as indentured servants. These impoverished laborers agreed to a term of indenture, usually 4 or maybe 7 years, in exchange for a trip across the Atlantic and an eventual chance at settling land for themselves. This was the terms of indentured servitude. Now, indentured servants, similar to chattel slavery, but was different in the respect that indentured servants could file abuse claims in a court of law, whereas slaves could not. Now, when the tobacco trade became more lucrative, colonists started casting their eyes on more land that technically belonged to Native Americans. And of course, this caused a series of violent conflicts between the two people groups, with one of the worst occurring in March 22nd, 1622, when the Powhatans launched a coordinated attack on 19 settlements all at the same time. About a third of the white population of Virginia was completely wiped out during this Powhatan uprising. Back in England, King James got word that things were not going well for his English colonists. Many had died due to disease or at the hands of hostile Native Americans. His Virginia company was nearly bankrupt, and so King James dissolved the company in 1624 and decided to absorb Virginia as a royal colony under the authority of the English crown. Of course, no, you can see the handwriting on the wall in all this as more and more English colonists began to arrive in America and struggle against the laws and taxes imposed upon them from across the Atlantic. In 1620, a group of English settlers sailed on the Mayflower from Plymouth, England, and landed in Massachusetts, naming their new colony the Plymouth Colony. Most call them pilgrims, but they were actually separatists who were frustrated with the Church of England. Most of these separatists were Calvinistic in their faith and called themselves Puritans, as they sought to purify themselves from the corrupt Anglican faith still going on in England. Of course, it wasn't long before theological differences arose amongst the new colonists, most notably those who disagreed with the Puritans. These folks were called dissenters, and two prominent dissenters were Roger Williams, a Baptist who separated from the Puritans and founded Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson, who began preaching on her own, holding meetings and teaching that salvation had nothing to do with being good or keeping laws. Of course, she was right. Among those who were evangelized during this period, a Puritan minister named John Eliot set up what were called praying towns for saved Indians and even translated the Geneva Bible into a language for the Massachusetts Indians. There was also an increase in immigration of English colonists during the mid 1600s, so much so that two distinct regions were formed: the Middle Colonies, which included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the Southern Caribbean colonies like Barbados and Jamaica, which became quite lucrative for the English crown back across the Atlantic. When all the farmable land had been exhausted on these sugar islands, as they were called, planters looked to the Carolinas to expand their cash crop plantations. The last of the mainland English colonies founded was Georgia by a man named James Oglethorpe, who wanted Georgia to serve as sort of a buffer zone against Spanish expansion. Oglethorpe called it Georgia in honor of the current king, King George II. The arrival of the English and other Europeans in eastern North America and the Caribbean unleashed massive transformations for Native Americans, and these changes often began with epidemic diseases, but soon most Eastern Indians faced pressure to give up their land. The English economy also drew Native Americans into unfamiliar patterns of hunting animals for fur export and introduced them to new technologies such as flintlock muskets. And that would add to the violence that characterized the first century of English colonization. As more and more English colonists saw the benefit of farming cash crops such as sugar and tobacco, more and more slaves were demanded. And at the same time, the French fur trade caused certain Indian tribes, primarily those comprised from the Iroquois League, to align themselves with the French. And these alliances, these tribal alliances, consisted of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And these two issues really exacerbated the already strained relationship between the French, and it set the stage for the mastery of North America. And with that, we will stop. If I can figure this out.